line up the New Testament in the order in which it is written, you find that our understanding keeps growing. Virgin birth comes into the text in the 9th decade in Matthew's writing. It's repeated in Mark and Luke's writing.
Can you document this? Can you actually demonstrate that the order that you're assuming is actually the order that...
Well, you see, that's where we get to the place where we're disagreeing not on opinions, but we're disagreeing on facts.
Yes.
But let me go back to Paul, for example. Paul says that Jesus was descended from the house of David according to the flesh. Mark doesn't have any virgin birth story in it, but Mark portrays the mother of Jesus in chapters 3 and 6 as thinking Jesus is out of his mind and she's going to put him away. Well, that doesn't ring very true with a woman to whom the angel Gabriel appeared and said, you're going to have this child, he's going to be the Son of God, and when he's grown up, you think he's out of his mind. So I think it's fairly clear that Mark had never heard the story of the virgin birth. And when you get to John, which I believe, and I would say most scholars agree with this, is the last of the canonical Gospels, John doesn't have any virgin birth in him at all. John refers to Jesus on 2 occasions, one in chapter 1, I think the others in chapter 6, as the son of Joseph. But all of them agree on what I think is the Christian affirmation that in Jesus, God has been met and engaged in a way that has transformed all human life and our knowledge of God forever. So that, to play the fundamentalist game about the Bible does not lead me into that wonder of mystery. And
that is our time, folks. And we thank you, Bishop Spong and Dr. James White.
And we have closing statements?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Absolutely. We are going to take a 5-minute break as we bring the podium back. I want to thank you for remaining quiet and allowing these gentlemen to speak during this time. And I hope you will as well afford them that here when we get into our closing statements and then into our audience questions. I am going to limit audience questions to 20 minutes. And how you're going to help me there is if you please keep your question under 30 seconds. Also, please do not start with your life story, okay? Either how you became a Christian or how you left Christianity or whatever the case may be. Please ask the question directly. Allow them to answer. I will hold the microphone. Okay, please. We had an instance last year where someone was bound and determined to convert Dr. Crossan last year, and he was wrestling that thing away from me. And basically, we need you to ask your question, do so politely, and allow these gentlemen to answer. After each gentleman answers, they will have about a minute and a half to answer is basically where we want to keep it. Then the other gentleman here, or whatever the case may be, will have about 30 seconds to respond. And keep it brief. I want to make sure we all get back into our beds at a proper time and make sure food gets into their stomachs here. But then at the end, those of you that are cruisers, I do have some announcements for you. So you're going to have to stay up late. So, all right, folks. We will start right now. And actually, Bishop Spong is going to be taking his mic and won't be approaching the podium. It's up to him to take the stage wherever he'd like to go.
A little bit, just so I can see the people. I've never really liked to stand behind podiums because I think it's a mighty fortress that protects you from people, and I don't ever want to act like I'm afraid of an audience because I think what we're doing is seeking the truth. My concluding statement is much more of a witness than it is anything else, because I think we've identified the fact today that we start with two different presuppositions and that they pass in the night. If you accept his presupposition, you come to a conclusion. If you accept mine, you come to a different conclusion. And I'm quite content to leave it to God to decide who's right and who's wrong, because I think human beings oftentimes are quite arrogant in the way that they say, I have the truth. So I'd like to sort of share with you how or some experiences I've had that have enabled me as a person born in a Southern fundamentalist evangelical tradition came to the place where I suspect that I am the point guard in my church's struggle to accept fully gay and lesbian people. It was in 1988 that I wrote a book called Living in Sin with a question mark. The subtitle was A Bishop Rethinks Human Sexuality. It was a very important book in my life. I had no idea what it would do. But it suddenly lifted me out of being a private citizen, and my publisher, HarperCollins, put me into a book tour, and I was on the Oprah show and the Phil Donahue show and Bill Buckley's Firing Line. I debated Pat Buchanan and did all sorts of interesting and exciting things. And it was the first book in which a person from a mainline Christian church had advocated a rethinking of the way that we relate to homosexual people, and even call for the blessing of the sacred commitments of gay and lesbian people. And it created quite a bit of storm. Time magazine, Newsweek, the media all over the country debated this book, and I received an enormous amount of hate mail, usually from Christians. The fascinating thing about this was that about 2 months after this book came out, when I'd been on this whirlwind tour, my wife, who had been ill with cancer for 6.5 years, died. A sudden death, even though we knew about the diagnosis. And so in the midst of this storm of public activity, I was also caught up in the deep emotional grief of having lost a wife of 37 years and the mother of my children. We had her funeral service in the Diocese of Newark, where my clergy family and my constituents could be gathered around. And then, because we had lived in Richmond and owned a burial plot in Richmond, we went back to Richmond to have the funeral, the burial service. And because I have daughters that live in Richmond, and we had a lot of friends when I served that church in Richmond, we had another service in the church before we went out to the burial. It was at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in August 1988. And I was sitting beside my wife's casket with my daughters and their husbands or their fiancés, as it was at that point, in the row with me to listen to the music that we had picked because it had been my wife's favorite. About 5 minutes before the service began, the door of this church opened, and a woman whom I do not know walked down the aisle, pushed my wife's casket aside, took her umbrella and cracked me over the back with it, and said in a voice that you could hear all over that congregation, quote, "You son of a bitch," unquote. And then she walked past the front of the church where we were sitting and out through the side door where all of my pallbearers were gathered, and all of them were priests from the Diocese of Newark. And as she walked through my pallbearer, she said, and I quote, "I've been wanting to tell that bastard what I think of him for years, and I finally got the opportunity." And she disappeared, and I have no idea who she was or what she was about. I can only guess that because of the massive amount of publicity, that her response was elicited by my stand.